Hello, and welcome to episode 441 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this pollen-filled day, Bill?
I'm doing okay for a pollen-filled day, Seth.
Oof, God, my truck was highlighter green this morning. It's disgusting. It really is bad. Joining us as usual is our good friend, fantastic historian Jon Parshall. How are you this pollen-filled day, John?
I am sleep deprived after daylight savings time, as well are we all. So yeah,
Yes, it
it'll
sucks.
be fine, right?
It will. It will.
Yeah,
Eventually, by the
have a
time
little
you get
history
used to
fun.
it, by the time you
Hmm.
get used to this time change, it'll change again. So,
Right, exactly.
yeah, we have hmm, excuse me, we have a good topic to talk about today, and I was talking about it before we hit record here, obviously with one of my staff members out here, and he's like, "That doesn't sound like an interesting topic." And I said, "It's because you don't know all the
Oh, it
ins and outs
is.
about it."
Contraire.
It's interesting. Some stuff
Indeed.
here, folks, you will never have heard of.
Yeah.
So, with the announcement of the surrender of Japan, the United States broke out into a joyous rapture, the likes of which had not been seen before or since. At long last, the war that had consumed the better part of 46 months for the United States and taken the lives of over 400,000 Americans, not to mention millions upon millions of Chinese, Indonesians, Vietnamese, and other Asian allies, as well as our European allies, was finally over. The United States and its citizenry finally took a deep breath and prepared for their sons and daughters to come home. However, before any of that could happen, there was some groundwork that had to be laid in Japan. With the surrender finally decided on, the U.S. just didn't march into Tokyo. The occupation had to be set up, the defeated enemy had to be made to toe the line, and above all of that, there was a very sincere feeling of mistrust that flowed through both of the former belligerents. Would the Japanese really surrender? Would there be more bloodshed? Would the occupation of the empire go smoothly? Orchestrating the majority of that groundwork would be one man who was arguably the most popular man in the United States. I know it, Bill just kind of had a twitch when I said that. People
Winced.
people held him in veneration then as they did saints or sports heroes. So it was no surprise to anyone, least of all General Douglas MacArthur, that he would be made SCAP. No, not scab, SCAP, Supreme Commander Allied Powers. President Truman had appointed Mac to that position to preside over Japan's military, logistical, and psychological demilitarization. As the recognized Supreme Commander, a title that Mac absolutely relished, it was only fitting for him to preside over the surrender ceremony that would take place. MacArthur planned the ceremony to the T. It would be short and sweet, and Mac would write the speech. Despite the brevity of the surrender ceremony that would mark the end of history's deadliest war, there was still plenty of pomp and circumstance, high theatrical drama, a little bit of stage fright, and one hell of a flyover. So, the culmination of all of this, especially in the last several weeks that we've been talking about, the culmination of all these things that we've been talking about, this is a high moment in world history right here, the surrender ceremony.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of just fascinating little details about what went on the veranda deck of the Missouri, which you can still see today, which is amazing, I think. The fact that you can go on board the Missouri and actually stand on the very place that this document was signed. But yeah, there's a lot of prep work that has to happen beforehand, and then a lot of intriguing things that are happening on the deck itself when it goes down. So,
Indeed,
Yeah,
indeed.
Missouri was a stone's throw from my house on Ford Island.
yeah.
And, as much as I relish throwing stones at MacArthur, in this phase of the operation, he does quite well. And I'm not
Yes.
ashamed to say that, although this is the start of his writing of his own hagiography, I would say.
Yeah.
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 One might say that started before, but
Yeah, I
in
was
all,
going to say it was well along, but
yeah,
this is
Good point.
a new and
Yeah.
glorious chapter is about to be written. So, yeah.
indeed,
Mhm.
indeed. So within hours of the announcement of the surrender, MacArthur's office in Manila began broadcasting to Tokyo itself specific instructions regarding the arrival of American troops. Despite the acceptance of the surrender, As we said in just a minute ago, no one knew for sure whether or not the Japanese would honor that surrender and accept the American occupiers without throwing lead at them. There was general and well-founded apprehension. And as we talked about last week, we had been reading their diplomatic mail for
Yep.
traffic for a long time. So we knew that there was some serious,
There were holdouts.
yeah,
In
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, there was a lot of wrangling going back and forth between Tokyo and its armies in the field. As you know, you will lay down your arms, and there was obviously there wasn't much of a precedent for this. You know, there had been no organized surrender of any Japanese unit during the entire war. That just wasn't a thing. So yes, we were definitely apprehensive going into this.
Or during
So
their entire history. So
Pretty much, yeah,
going back over 1,000 years. Go ahead.
yeah.
I was gonna say before any of that happened, though, before any of this surrender happened, a delegation, Japanese delegation, lands in Manila and was instructed on what to do and what not to do in terms of the demilitarization. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, and some of the pictures from that are just absolutely fascinating too, in that we told the Japanese, okay, you're going to take some of your G4M Betty bombers, you are
And
to
I'm
paint
white.
them white, you are to put green crosses on them so that they are going to be clearly marked as surrender aircraft. And then, yeah, your surrender party goes into those planes. I'm not sure if they were escorted by our fighters or not. I think they may have been. And then, yeah, they have to make their way down to Manila and land their delegation to go talk to Mac.
Yeah, they make a stopover on Okinawa too, because there's
Oh, I didn't know that.
photographs. There's pictures of the White Betty, like they call it the
Yeah.
surrender plane, landing there at I think it's Yantan, or it
Okay.
might have been Kadena. Regardless, they're landing on Okinawa, and and the airfield is surrounded by armed
Hmm.
Marines. So
I'm
you know
sure.
the Japanese board that airplane were like, oh my God.
Good God. Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah.
once they get into Manila, Bill, they talk to none other than, one of the other dramatis personae that we've talked about for years, not with very high regard, Dick Sutherland.
Yeah, that's right, Seth. He sits down with General Kawabe Torishiro and laid out the surrender orders for the Japanese. While neither could speak out each other's language, interestingly, they both spoke German. Imagine that. There's a Japanese guy, an American guy communicating to each other in German. So the conversation between them was relatively simple. I guess you could say that. In his orders, Sutherland said that the Japanese would accept the U.S. entry into the conquered nation. They would guarantee safe passage for all US echelons moving inland once they landed, and further required all Japanese forces to withdraw, immobilize, disarms, lay down their weapons. This means aircraft, tanks, whatever. Sutherland then issued Nimitz's orders to the Japanese fleet, which was all Japanese ships were to remain in port. Ships that were currently at sea must report their locations in plain language. All breech blocks must be removed from all weapons aboard ship. The main batteries must point fore and aft only. All torpedo tubes must be emptied, and it helps if the breech doors open so you can verify them empty. Then ships at sea must proceed to the nearest, get this, to the nearest Allied port. If they were to enter at night or dusk, their searchlights had to be pointed straight up vertically and remain so until overtaken by an Allied vessel. Submarines needed to stay on the surface and were to fly, this is appropriate, a black flag. And the submarines had to present themselves either at Guam, Midway, or Subic Bay. So there's a whole bunch of activity with the Imperial Japanese Navy, Seth, but there's all these mines we have to take care of. What are we doing about that?
So,
Yeah.
and John, I know you probably want to comment on this too. I mean, we had seeded the area around Japan with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds
Thousands
of
of miles.
mines, and it's all kinds of different mines. They're
Yeah.
not like, the type A mine. I mean, there's influence mines, there's contact mines, there's all kinds
Acoustic
of mines.
mines,
Yeah,
contact mines. Yeah. Just the whole schmear. And
Floating mines, moored mines, bottom
you know
mines,
it.
bottom
you
You know
name
it.
mines,
it.
the whole
Yeah.
smack. And actually, one of the more interesting museums that I go to when I'm in Japan with the World War II museum tours is the JMSDF museum that is
Mm.
also in Kure, right across the street from the museum that's got the big model of Yamato in it. And one of the things that they spend a lot of time talking about in there is the JMSDF's prowess at minesweeping, which
I
came
bet.
about directly as a result of their post-war experience. Because yeah,
Mhm.
their harbors and seaways are just full of mines. And so yes, those were some of the ships that we did not, decommission or anything like that. We had to start using them immediately, along with American minesweepers as well, to come in and try to put their ports back on their feet again so that we could start getting imports into this country again. It was a gargantuan task.
Tremendous task,
Yeah.
tremendous, and it's pretty cool too that the Japanese minesweepers would operate their own crew, the
Yep.
crew that was aboard that ship, but they'd be flying Old Glory.
An
They would
American
not be.
flag.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Sure, they loved that.
Oh, I'm sure they were absolutely over the moon about that.
Sorry, not sorry. So
It's
yeah,
what you get. You get what you
yeah,
pay for. So all aircraft, of which there were thousands ashore on the home islands, would be grounded, obviously, and would remain so. All propellers would be removed and laid before the nose of the aircraft so that they could clearly be seen as disabled by Allied aerial recon flights. And there's photographs of this. You can see these things. You can see these, their props. They're just whoop, laid right out in front of the nose of the bird, and it's very, very clear that they're
course, there was
disabled.
that one incident. Is it Atsugi Airfield that there was a brief rebellion there where a
Yes.
couple of officers were like, "No, we're not going to do that," and not going to turn the base over, and we're not going to disarm our planes. And it finally required. This was before the introduction of American troops, I believe. The Japanese rolled in there and said, "No, no, no, dude. Oh, and by the
It
way, you can kill yourself too."
it actually happened twice.
Okay.
It actually happened twice because these orders were issued, and exactly to your point, there were several Japanese either bases or elements of those aerial bases that were like, nope, we ain't doing this. We're not going to surrender. We're going to continue to fight. And we had B-32 Dominators, which is an aircraft we never talk about,
Never
flew.
talk about.
Oh, yeah, I know, and it's a cool bird.
Yeah.
Flew over Japan to take air recon photos of this very thing, and they were attacked twice by Japanese fighters after the acceptance of the Japanese surrender.
Right.
Nobody was killed, and the planes were like very very slightly damaged. But yeah, it was very. So I mean, you can see why the apprehension about the Japanese surrender
Right.
was very very real.
Yeah.
So navigational lights will be lit. As we said, all harbor nets and gates will be opened. Demolition charges will be removed. Minefields will be swept. And they continue to sweep these long after the surrender
Oh,
ceremony because it
this was
didn't happen in a
years,
week. Oh, yeah.
years long effort on the part of the Japanese to finally clear those harbors. It took
Yep.
forever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So harbor pilots would be made ready for use by Allied ships with the most up-to-date charts if they had them. With the terms laid out for the first occupation troops to land in Japan, the task at hand now became to get the Americans ashore as quickly and as safely as possible. So the occupation of Japan, or at least first portion of it, was named Operation Blacklist, which is a pretty cool name for the
Um,
final operation
Mhm.
of the war. Mac was nothing if not self-assured, and in May 1945, May
he had started.
1945, yeah, he instructs his staff to begin planning for the eventual occupation of the empire. The plan provided for the possibility of the surrender of or complete collapse of the Japanese government. So again, old General Doug,
He was ahead of
he's
the curve on
he's
that one.
ready. He's ready to go. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, no, I don't blame him for that, though. This is something that needed to be done. So the purpose of Blacklist would be the initial primary missions of the occupation forces were set out as being the disarmament of the Japanese armed forces and the establishment of control of communications. Communications in this case doesn't mean talking as much. It does mean that, but it also means flow of goods as well into and out of Japan. MacArthur fully intended to use the emperor and other Japanese leaders in executing every aspect of the occupation, being thoroughly familiar with Japanese administration. Above all, Americans were concerned, and rightfully so, about the possibility of Japanese resistance, just like you said, Seth, and a counterinsurgency that could very well sweep across the country. Even when landed in force, the conquering Allied forces would be vastly outnumbered, and thus the early good relations with the defeated enemy must be set in stone from the start. So Seth, he's got these plans in place, and he's pretty much able to execute them as they were planned. But we added a whole bunch of layers of this plan once we really started executing, didn't we?
We did. And, it's something to think about too when you just said, when we get our people there, we're going to be vastly outnumbered. And that's the God's honest truth. But if you think about Germany, first of all, was surrounded. And, there were Brits, there were Free French, there were Americans in there were Soviets in there. So we outnumbered them, or at the very least, we were 1-to-1. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, I would be willing to say we had a hell of a lot more people on the ground.
There was
This is
significant
completely
combat.
opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
Mhm.
the complete opposite of that. I mean, we have exactly zero Allied troops, with the exception of prisoners of war, in the home islands when all this stuff starts to go down. So, as you were saying, the key method in which the U.S. occupation forces were going to carry this out was by employing the Japanese themselves to do the majority of the work. Mack and his staff never intended for American troops to actually conduct all of the specific work necessary for accomplishing the numerous goals of the occupation, and there are a lot of them. It was emphasized that in the view of the limited forces that would have to occupy a country of roughly 80 million people,
Hmm.
Army commanders would make all possible use of Japanese demobilized forces and would take all steps to ensure the public servants, such as the civil police, railway workers, communication workers, utility operators, and public health officials, not only remained at their task, but intensified their efforts to ensure a continuation of all functions under what was certain to be a period of great stress. You think? Yeah.
Yeah. With a looming collapse of the food system coming too. Yeah.
Yeah. And and
We
and
didn't know
and
about that, of course, but yeah, that's what ends up happening. So
we didn't, but they did. The
yeah,
the Japanese could sense that the food situation was
yeah,
going
it
down
was
south.
bad.
So, yeah. So Mack later wrote that he cautioned his and I quote, troops from the start by their conduct of our own country would be judged in world opinion, that success or failure of the occupation could well rest upon their poise and self-restraint, unquote. And this is extremely important because this
Yep.
is a completely different culture than what's going on in San Francisco or Chicago. These are not Europeans at all. This is a
Yep.
completely different culture. It's an alien culture to
Yeah.
95% of the Americans that are going to be landing on these islands. I mean, that's a huge thing. John, you've lived there. Bill, you've been there. Respect in the
Mhm.
Japanese population and the way they conduct themselves is completely different than the
Yep.
way we did in the 1940s.
Yeah, it's a whole different vibe, that's for sure. It's interesting though, because sort of fast forwarding here, there were a number of incidents though early on in the occupation that I think cemented that good reputation for the American forces. I seem to recall reading about this in oh God, I'm spacing the name of the book. It talks about the immediate post-war situation in Japan. And one of the things that happened, I think this was in Tokyo actually, an American troop convoy was moving through the city, and one of our trucks accidentally hit a little girl. And our convoy immediately stopped, and troops get out. They get her in the back of our truck. We race off to an American hospital, save her life, you know, get her family, bring her back to the family, do all that. And the Japanese citizenry are like, oh my God, that would, our troops would never have done something like that. They just would have left the kid on the side of the road. And so it was little incidents like that. I'm not saying that our occupation was faultless. Obviously, there were,
Yeah.
anytime you got a group of several 100,000 soldiers in an occupied country, there are going to be problems. But in the main, our forces behaved themselves very well, and relations with the population were good from the get-go. So Mack's intended effect here was, in fact, effectuated, I would say.
So yeah, no, 100% agree, John. You know, the fact that the Americans actually cared and tried to, establish good relations, even from the outset, really
Yep,
pays dividends in the long run. And as you said, there's certainly some darker aspects to any occupation of a foreign land,
absolutely. I
but
mean,
by and large, the
by and
American
large,
occupation of Japan was pretty dang peaceful.
right? Yeah.
So Mack also added to what we just said that the Japanese would shoulder the chief administrative and operational burden of disarmament and demobilization. Unlike most counterinsurgencies, this aspect of Operation Blacklist was designed to avoid possible incidents which might result in a renewed conflict. No seizures or disarmaments were to be made by Allied personnel. It's brilliant.
Hmm.
When you got somebody who don't want to give up their weapons in the first place, the last thing they're going to want to do is give it up to some
Yep.
hayseed. Yeah,
Yeah,
from, give me your gun, boy. That ain't going to go over. That's going to go over like a
right.
fart in church. That's not going to go over well at all. So the fact that he's already figuring this out and laying this out, this is brilliant. So Bill, the first in to Japan would be none other than William Halsey's people, followed by my favorite United States Army general, Robert Eichelberger.
That's right, Seth. They would actually follow Joe Swing's 11th Airborne Division, which would land at Atsugi Air Base on August 26th. The paratroopers would recon the areas that the larger force would enter, install communications, and prepare for the larger force, which would arrive days later. Halsey and Eichelberger's commands would take care of the Tokyo Bay area, Honshu and Hokkaido. Let me share my screen if I can do that. So I'm going to kind of outline, if you could see it. You got it there?
Yep.
So, all right. So Honshu is the big island here. Hokkaido is up north. And down here, we've got, yep, Kyushu and
Shikoku.
Shikoku, right? So these are the islands as we lay them out. So Spruance is going to take the western and southern Honshu, plus Shikoku and Hokkaido and Kyushu. Okay, and Halsey and Eichelberger are going to take the main areas of Honshu and Hokkaido up north. The Brits are going to take the southern half of the Sea of Japan area. 7th Fleet and the 14th Airborne Corps would take Korea and China's neighboring coasts around here, this Yellow Sea here. The Army Air Force's Pacific Air Transport Command, some 89,000 men would establish and fly an air bridge from Okinawa to the home islands. Overall, some 707,000 of Mac's overall command would take part in the initial occupation of the empire. Now I'm going to zoom in here to the area around Tokyo. This bay here is called Sagami-wan. Wan means bay. Now, Halsey's third fleet or elements of it are going to enter Sagami-wan. I've driven in and out of here probably 40 or 50 times on August 27th. And you want to jump in here, John?
I was just going to say that Sagami-wan is also the same area where a lot of Japanese warships ran their trials after being built. So the famous pictures of Yamato that were taken in December of 41 running her trials were all taken right there in Sagami Bay.
Right. Now, if you want to get to Tokyo, you leave Sagami Bay and you go in here. This is Tokyo-wan here, Tokyo Bay. And it's really interesting. Yokosuka, the naval base that's been the center of so much Imperial Japanese Navy activity, we're going to talk about in a moment, is here because they're going to be cleared by UDT people. Yokohama and Tokyo is way up here. So when they go deep into Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony, it would be up here. The interesting thing about driving in and out of here, there's little islands, tiny islands that still have feudal castles on them. And going past these islands, as I did so many times driving into Yokosuka, was absolutely fascinating. You can reeks Japanese history here. Now, Halsey's third fleet entered Sagami-wan on August 27th. Escorted by the destroyers O'Bannon, Nicholas, Taylor, Stockham, and Waldron. Halsey and Missouri pulled into the area, followed by elements of the Royal Navy, which included the battleship Duke of York. Nicholas was the first in. She met a Japanese destroyer, took some harbor pilots aboard, and made her way in. The following day, the fleet entered Tokyo Bay from Sagami-wan. And then Halsey made sure that every ship that passed into the bay was noted. So guys, there's a lot of activity going on here at this period of time. And Halsey has absolute deliberate control over everything that happens.
Mm-hmm. He's not ignorant on the fact of the historical nature of this entire event. Everything from the beginning to the very, very end. And he made deliberate notes of every single ship that went in and the order in which they came in, just for history's sake. So, the first one that led the battleships in there was to destroy, inappropriately so, destroyer Minesweeper Ellison DMS 19, and as I put in the note, a legion of others. And we're not going to go through them all. You can look it up. It's there. A PB-2Y Coronado landed in the bay carrying none other than Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who, once out of the aircraft, moved to the USS South Dakota, where he hoisted his flag for the surrender ceremony, which would soon follow that. The procession into Tokyo Bay was absolutely tremendous. More than 250 Allied vessels of various shapes and sizes made their way in, dropped anchor, and waited with crews at general quarters, weapons trained towards the shore. And as I put in the notes, conspicuously absent from all of these were the fast carriers. They were not there.
Yeah.
For good reason.
Mhm.
Yes. Yep.
So a select crew, and we can well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the whole reason that the fast carriers aren't there. So I mean, it's as we've made
It's twofold.
numerous, yeah,
One
numerous
is
hints.
you want to have your main offensive firepower in a position where it is not threatened in case there is Japanese treachery. And two, as we have alluded to, there's going to be a flyover during the surrender ceremony, and those ships are going to be providing those aircraft, and they obviously can't be conducting flight operations if they're sitting in the middle of Tokyo Bay.
Correct. But
Mhm.
I think the overall cloud is certainly the we don't want our carriers to get hit
Yep.
like sitting ducks sitting in Tokyo Bay if the Japanese do indeed decide to do something really, really
Yeah.
stupid.
Pull a fast one.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So a select crew from USS South Dakota from Sodak was chosen by her skipper, and along with several of the ship's Marine detachment, boarded the former IJN battleship Nagato. And John, we've talked about her a lot. The former flagship's skeleton crew bowed to and saluted nearly every American, regardless of their rank, that came aboard Nagato. And South Dakota's sailors scrambled up Nagato's mast, removed her national ensign, and hoisted Old Glory. The former combined fleet flagship was now a war prize
Yep.
of the United States Navy. And we've talked about it before, but dish on it again. John, Nagato was not what she was in
No,
1941.
she was in very sad shape at this point. She had her main mast cut down. Most of her anti-aircraft guns had been removed to form shore batteries. She Her engines weren't really in very good shape at this point, so power was being supplied by a coal-fired donkey boiler. Yeah, not a shadow of her former self, unfortunately,
Yeah.
and also infested with rats. So
Ugh.
yeah, not a yeah. There are numerous accounts about that when they're taking Nagato out to Bikini for the Operation Crossroads trials. That they first of all we had to figure out how to nurse this power plant back to life and so that she can limp her way out there, and then yeah, the ship is just nasty.
Ugh.
So ugh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
Anyway,
gross. So, as all of this is going on, 8th Army GIs under Eichelberger swarmed ashore while UDT teams swept through the Yokosuka Naval Base, disarming weapons, demo charges, and the like, of which there were none, by the way. There were no demo charges that the UDTs found because the orders that were issued to the Japanese before all this that we talked about were followed to the T.
yep.
Finding no demo chargers, as I said, or booby traps, the UDT team set up a perimeter and waited just like everybody else. Not long after, elements of the 4th Marines landed and took formal control over the Japanese naval base from Vice Admiral Tozuka Mishitaro. The Marines were fully loaded for combat, as we said, ready to rock and roll, but like everywhere else, they found
No
nothing.
need,
Yeah.
nothing.
Mhm.
Yep. This is one of the benefits, frankly, of having a fairly consensus based society like the Japanese. They are, say what you will about them, they are by and large extremely orderly. And, other than, yeah, the fact we've had a few holdouts here, I think the majority of the citizenry is just like, thank God this thing is over. I really do believe that. So yeah, the people that they were meeting on the streets, these Marines were just perfectly cheerful to have them there. No problem at
Absolutely.
all.
Other
Absolutely.
than the occasional attempt to kill the emperor, they were very compliant.
Well, but by and large, again, yes, are there some blips on the radar? Yeah, but again, I just look at the way that the Japanese eventually did end up laying down their arms, even in places like
Mhm.
China and Manchuria.
Yeah.
This was miraculous if you put this into the larger context of what combat had been like against this particular opponent throughout this war.
Yeah.
We got off practically scot-free. Yes, there were some
Yep.
problems along the way, but by and large, yeah, very smooth sailing.
Hmm.
So you talked about the Japanese citizenry who were, as you said, for the most part, like, whew, glad this is
Yeah.
over with. Let's just see how the occupation goes. To that end, Halsey's chief of staff, whom we've talked about here and there in the past, Mick Carney, rode through the area with Tezuka, the gentleman we just talked about, and encountered children often, which is, very common throughout Japan. He wrote later, quote, "Kids in the street made the V for victory sign and smiled broadly at us. How do you interpret this thing?" He wrote. The chief of staff said later that he found the civilian attitude to be, and I quote, "scarier than if we'd found a sullen, resistant attitude. The thing was weird," unquote.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
So,
We're suffering here ourselves from a lot of PTSD. It's been a long war, it's been a brutal war. And yeah, to be greeted with smiles by the same people that in different circumstances would have been throwing themselves off of cliffs or blowing
yes.
themselves up with grenades. Yeah, the whole vibe is just very, very strange.
Yeah, the same children who weeks before had been training to
Right.
kill Americans with bamboo spears, are
Right.
now given the
Hmm.
the V for victory
Yep.
as the GIs
Right.
and the Marines and the sailors are rolling ashore. It's
Yeah,
it
Seth,
it's you. Go ahead, Bill.
I've got, I got a photo on my wall here from Baghdad of children
Yeah,
smiling and waving at me. This probably March 2003, really early in the war, and that's exactly what it reminded me of. And
Hmm.
things didn't go well there either.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting.
Kids are always the first ones to accept because they're the most innocent of them all.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So by August the 30th, just a few days later, more than 300 C-54 Skymasters were ferrying Americans into the Tokyo area from the Philippines. 24 aircraft landed at Atsugi every hour or one every 3 minutes. The sheer logistical maneuver vastly impressed the Japanese. Man, and it did. The amount of men and material brought into the area in such a short time was absolutely astonishing to these people. And you have to know that some of these guys, some of these maybe hardliners who, certainly didn't want to surrender, are watching these GIs just
Yeah.
pour
Pouring
ashore and
in.
going, yeah, we couldn't beat this. There's no
Yeah.
way.
How
Yeah.
could we ever have taken this on? There's just no way.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So another person arrives on August the 30th, and this is a masterful stroke of psychology. Bill, lay it on us. Who gets to Japan on the 30th?
Got to give him credit, Seth. So he flies in from Okinawa on a C-54 named Baton. Okay, okay. There's some guts there. The Supreme Commander
Yep.
paced the floor of the bird the whole ride up for 5 hours. This guy was really, really nervous throughout
He
Yes.
these several days. As Mount Fuji appeared, he sat down in the right seat and waited there for the remainder of the flight. Landing at Atsugi, Mack instructed all of his officers and men aboard the plane to remove their sidearms and leave them on the airplane. His message: we have nothing to fear. We have beaten you. We're not even going
Right.
to carry weapons. A nice gesture and a master stroke of psychology. An unarmed conqueror with no fear. Well played, Mac. As Mac rode in a motorcade of about 50 vehicles and made his way through the streets of Tokyo, he nears his temporary headquarters. The streets were lined up with American soldiers, all at present arms. Oh, he loved that. Arriving at the new Grand Hotel in Tokyo, Mac was reunited with General Jonathan Wainwright. We're going to talk more about how Wainwright gets here in a moment, as well as British General Percival. Both men, former prisoners of war, were skin and bones. The reunion between Mac and Wainwright was brought about by yet another special operation in the days leading up to the surrender. This is cloak and dagger stuff, Seth, we're going to talk about here, isn't it?
It is, and it's freaking cool.
Hey, I was completely unaware of this actually until you put it in the notes. So that's pretty cool.
It is damn cool. It is damn cool. So, I mean, we knew obviously that there are tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war all over Japan and Asia. We know this. This is nothing. It's not lost on us in any way, shape, or form. MacArthur
including
made
yeah, I mean, but these guys in Japan, right? Like O'Kane
yes.
and Happy Boyington and all those folks, right? So we would assume that Wainwright and the American and the British senior POWs were there as well, but they weren't.
They were not. They were not. I mean, some of them were, but the vast majority of them, and specifically these two guys, were most certainly not. I mean, Allied intel had pointed out that Wainwright and Percival were probably in Mukden, which is, the scene of some of the very earliest fighting of the entire Pacific conflict for obvious reasons. Of course, Wainwright had been captured in Bataan, actually had been surrendered on Corregidor in 1942. After Mac left Bataan, Wainwright became responsible for American forces in the Philippines. And we're just going to lay this out real quick so people understand who the heck he is. It was Wainwright that formally surrendered American troops on Corregidor, and it was Wainwright that Mac had initially blamed for not fighting until the end. So that was just asinine and foolishness on his part. And Mac later said that because Wainwright was initially recommended for the Medal of Honor, and it was MacArthur who turned it down, saying that Wainwright should have fought to the very end, and it was his fault that the Philippines were lost. But
and by the way, Mac then engineers his own Medal of Honor, and that needed to be said. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, what were you going to say?
And for those who are not familiar with Percival, Percival was the commander of the British forces in Malaya and was captured at the end of that campaign when Singapore fell on February 15th, 1942. So Percival presided over arguably the largest surrender of British arms in their history and then went into captivity as well. So these are arguably, not arguably, they are the two most senior Allied commanders in Japanese captivity, Wainwright and Percival.
And definitely the highest profile for sure. These are names that are going to be recognized by the American and Allied public. They're going to know who the heck these guys are. So as time progressed, Mac's feelings towards Wainwright softened somewhat, and especially after Mac got into the Philippines and liberated the Philippines, his opinions on Wainwright, dang, that's hard for me to say, was
I've never really understood what the impetus and the catalyst was for that change of opinion. I mean,
I don't know.
Doesn't seem like Mac is really the kind of guy who changes his mind terribly often, and so
no.
I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know. But as we're going to see, the reunion is definitely very, very tender-hearted.
Yeah.
But it is an absolute fact that Mac was the guy that said, nope, he's not getting the Medal of Honor. Boom. He should have fought to the end. Da, 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 da. I think it was, I liken it back to what we said when we did the Philippine liberation episodes, is that Mac had been struggling for years to get to the Philippines. That was his only goal. To get back to the Philippines, I should say. That was his only goal throughout the dang war. And then once he gets there, and before that, he acts like a petulant child. And then once he gets there, he's a completely different dude. He's a completely different commander. And you can see, I mean, like, if you go back and listen to some of the episodes we talk about when, the prisoners are liberated at Santo Tomas, these are people he knew.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So his attitude, like personally and socially, like he knew these people. And his attitude just completely does a 180. So, and I think the same thing is there with Wainwright, because a lot of the troops that he liberates, or that his forces liberate, I should say, in the Philippines are Wainwright's people.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different aspect from his point, I think, at that point. Bill, you were going to say
Well,
something?
and
Or John?
also just in Wainwright's defense, I mean, his decision to surrender when he decided to do so was absolutely correct in that,
Mhm.
That's right.
uh, you know, if the Japanese had gotten loose in Malinta Tunnel and into the hospital sections
Oh,
full
they'd
of
have killed everybody.
nurses and wounded, yeah, just killed everybody. It just would have been a bloodbath to absolutely no point whatsoever. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. No, all I
So,
was going to say is, I think maybe talking to folks in the Philippines after he got there might have caused him to soften a bit.
yeah,
But
maybe
ja
so.
but
possibly.
yeah, but let the record show that MacArthur was absolutely wrong on his opinion of Wainwright, and
Yeah,
he finally corrected it. So I'll give him credit for that.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, fair.
So American officials feared that the Japanese would kill the prisoners of war in the Mukden areas, or the Soviets may, because remember, there's kind of a
So there's this huge invasion going on at this
yeah,
time,
yeah,
Yeah,
and it's still moving ahead, even though, yeah, it's a hot
and
mess. And so,
and
how are we
I
going
don't
to
think
get
you've
these
said it,
prisoners
Seth.
out?
This is Manchuria we're talking about, right? So
Right,
for
right.
everybody. Mm.
So the Allies developed a plan to send in OSS agents. That's the Office of Strategic Services. These are the guys that are the
Predecessor to the
forerunners to this.
CIA.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Mm.
They're going to be sent in to liberate and protect Allied prisoners, not just Wainwright and Percival, but others too in that area, but specifically these two guys. They're going to be only six-man teams. They're going to be organized for rescue and humanitarian operations. These guys, or these missions that they're going to be sent on, became known as mercy missions. Nine teams were organized for missions throughout northern China and Manchuria. Of these, the Cardinal mission, or Operation Cardinal, became the highest profile operation. The mission launched a parachute drop of a carefully selected OSS team into Manchuria, 900 miles from the Allied headquarters at Chungking.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's pretty crazy.
It is. Bill, tell
Yeah,
us about the guy who's running this.
Well, there were six of them, right? So it's a big enough unit to stand up against whatever resistance they
the
might
Kuomintang
encounter.
Army. Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So led by Army Major Robert F. Hennessy, a 27-year-old West Point graduate, he was selected as leader. Major Robert F. Lamar, a 31-year-old physician, for good reason, was second in command. In early August, Hennessy and Lamar, along with four other OSS men, parachuted into Manchuria in the vicinity of prison camp at Hoten, near the city of Mukden. Wainwright, however, could not be found. The camp commander advised the OSS officers that the general was held 100 miles to the north at the Sian POW compound. Hennessy directed Lamar and Sergeant Harold Leith, a linguist fluent in both Russian and Chinese, to travel to the Sian camp and locate Wainwright. So what do? They jump on a train. After a
on a train.
long and a train, after a long and arduous nocturnal train ride, Lamar and Leith arrived at the Sian camp on the morning of Sunday, August 19th. The two OSS agents met with the camp commander, and after a short but confrontational discussion, General Wainwright was summoned. General Wainwright suddenly appeared in the doorway of the commander's office. And you can imagine what's going through his head at this point, right?
Yeah,
Why am I being summoned?
Yeah,
Maybe the Japanese are losing and we're all going to be killed. The
right.
emaciated American hero stood silently in tattered clothing. The OSS men stared at each other with stunned disbelief. Wainwright broke the silence. Are you really an American? He asked. General, you're no longer a prisoner of war. You're going back to the States, Lamar responded. Wainwright, however, was conflicted. He had survived over 3 years of brutal captivity and was afraid of what his fellow Americans thought of him. He was worried that all of America thought of him what MacArthur initially did. Would he return to
Mhm.
the United States in a disgrace and live the remainder of his life in shame? Wainwright responded slowly, his voice cracking with emotion, and asked the question he had agonized over for 3 terrible years. And this is just heartbreaking, guys.
yes, it is.
This this man, this is going to draw you to tears. What do the people in the United States think of me? He asked. You're considered a hero, Lamar replied. That is, can you imagine what went through his mind in that moment, guys?
The weight
Yeah.
of the world lifted off of that
Yep.
man's shoulders, at least for a
Yes.
temporary time.
And
So
Wainwright, his nickname, even before he went into
skinny.
captivity, was Skinny. And if you look at pictures
Mm,
of this guy, he and Percival, too, were both very tall, thin
Yes.
individuals. And 3 years of captivity has done neither of them much in the way of good. I forget how much he weighs, but it's, right around 100 some pounds. It's not much.
110. Yeah, it was terrible.
Good
Yeah,
Lord.
I mean,
He was a
he's like
mess.
if he turns sideways, he disappears. I mean,
Yeah, you
he's
couldn't see him. Yeah.
razor thin. And
Yeah.
Wainwright, he had a before the war and in the early stages, he had a drinking problem.
Yeah, he did.
I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily call him an alcoholic, but he was a heavy drinker.
Yeah.
And that had taken a physical toll on him before he was
Yes.
captured. And then of course he
Yep.
gets captured and is cold turkey after that. And that's a difficult thing, at least initially. One would
Yep.
think that 3 years later he's probably, you know,
Better off for it,
better
but
off, but still
except
three
for the
years of Japan.
malnutrition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And the diseases and everything else,
Right.
and the beatings and the torture of which he did suffer, by the way. The
Absolutely.
stars on his collar didn't mean squat.
And it needs to be reiterated too. I forget the exact percentage. But if you were a prisoner of the Japanese in this war, I think you had about a 27% chance of not surviving that captivity, which is vastly higher than if you were an Allied captive in a German POW camp. And of course, there are worse examples. Don't be a Soviet
No,
POW, at least in the first half of the war in a German camp. That won't get you very far. But in any case, captivity within the Japanese system was incredibly brutal and had a very high mortality rate. So, given those physical impediments, the fact that Wainwright just managed to live that long is saying something.
it is. It is indeed. So Lamar's next task is to get Wainwright and Percival out of there. Get them out of there like now and back to friendly Mukden and then Chungking. Lamar was most concerned with, rightfully so, with the thousands of armed Japanese in the area who were still willing to fight. Also concerning was the possibility of kidnap and outright murder. Lamar
Mhm.
felt that his best option was to leave Wainwright and Percival with Leith, head back to Chungking on his own, get a vehicle column to come and get the former POWs. Now, this is the same man who,
900 miles
yeah, man,
over
this,
Chinese road. And it needs to be emphasized here, too, just the situation in Manchuria is crazy at this point. That
Mhm.
with the Soviet steamroller coming through here, all order has just completely fallen apart. The Kwantung
yes,
army has collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians have disappeared into the maw of the Russian invasion, never to be seen again. There are harrowing stories of Japanese families who are fleeing to the south to try to make it to a port to get back home, who start these journeys with 4 or 5 children and only come out at the end with one or two and have left the others by the side of the road. I mean, they're just terrible, terrible things going on at this point in time. So it's not like I can just go to a motor pool and requisition a
right.
group of vehicles and whistle those up and, we'll get those. It's chaos here at this point.
Absolute chaos. It's very reminiscent of German civilians fleeing to the west
Absolutely.
ahead of the
Yes.
Russian steamroller, if you will. It's no different because
Exactly.
it's the
It's
same Soviets
exactly
here.
the same vibe here. There's no central coordinated authority within the Japanese zones anymore. People are, don't know what to do. Some of them are fleeing, some of them are staying. It's a nightmare.
It's the Wild West.
Yeah, it's the
So
Wild West.
for 3 days, Lamar, who tries to make this journey on his own, is missing. Like nobody knows where the hell he is. Nobody's heard anything from him. General Wainwright fears that he had been killed, that he'd been killed or
Yep.
beaten or captured or something has gone wrong. In fact, Lamar had actually arrived in Mukden, which was now under Soviet control and was essentially stuck because the Soviets are running the town and it's much like the
Who are
Soviets
you?
do in Germany. Yeah, they don't know,
Yeah.
nor do they care. and they're
Right.
running around Mukden and, drunken tirades like they do all over Germany. Finally, on August the 24th, a column of American-made vehicles show up at the Sian POW camp. Wainwright is elated. He's like, "Yes, thank you, God." But he grows dour when he realizes that the vehicles are American vehicles, but they're being driven by Russians.
Hmm.
Through an interpreter, Wainwright worked his way and the other former prisoners of war, including Percival, into a Soviet vehicle column bound for Mukden. A derailed train, no lie, a torrential downpour, and 3 days later, Wainwright, Percival, and others finally arrive in Mukden. And there's a lot more to that story that I'm talking about right now. I mean, they no kidding, get on a train and the dang thing comes off the
Goes off
freaking
the
tracks.
rails.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It's crazy. So once in Mukden, Lamar tried to locate Wainwright, and finally the OSS officer found the general at about 3 a.m. and informed him that two planes were waiting to fly him, Percival, and a selected group to Chungking. In Chungking, the general was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. Tears rolled down his sunken cheeks as the citation was read. And of course, he does later get the blue ribbon, but that comes later.
Mhm.
On August the 31st, Wainwright landed in Yokohama to meet with General MacArthur. He was apprehensive, fearing his old commander's reaction to the general who had surrendered American armed forces to the Japanese. When Mac
In
spotted the,
in the largest surrender of our arms, if you take the
yes,
full American forces into account, I mean that was about 70,000 guys laying down their arms.
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
probably the darkest day in American Army history, right there,
yeah.
or darkest
Probably
time,
is.
I should
Mhm.
say,
Yep.
darkest time. So when Mac spots Wainwright, he was in the middle of a conversation. MacArthur was in the middle of a conversation, and he literally looks over and he sees him standing there, and he stops everything he's doing, practically runs across the room. There's a crowded like dining room, like a banquet hall or whatever in the hotel, like blows through the crowd and immediately grabs Wainwright and just gives him this huge bear hug. And they were friends. Like, before all this goes down, they were friends. They were
Mhm.
cronies. They were buddies. And apparently nobody knows what was said, but apparently like the two were like very, faces very close to each other, and they were talking in whispers amongst each other and just, hugging each other like two long lost friends that,
Yeah.
hadn't seen each other in a long, long time. It was absolutely beautiful. It really was. It was a beautiful reunion. There's a famous picture of Mac, and he's looking at Wainwright and they're looking at each other and they're,
Yeah, I've
kind
seen
of
that.
embracing. And I'll show that here. But yeah, it was truly a beautiful moment. It really was. So, as I put in the
On to the main
notes,
show.
as I put in the notes, Barfarama, and
Barfarama.
we'll
Now we
get
come
to
to
that in a
Barfarama, which
minute.
doesn't sound very glorious, but yes, it's going to be glorious in the end.
In the end, it will. So, Bill, tell us about the formal signing of the surrender.
Yeah, so it takes place, of course, on the battleship Missouri. If you go to Pearl Harbor, and you can see it today. On the so it was serving as Halsey's third fleet flagship and had been doing so since he took command of the fleet in May. Mighty Mo had looked like every other warship of the Third Fleet when she entered Tokyo Bay, which means she was a rusted wreck, beat up and scarred. Mo required a real heavy cleanup for the big day, which she did receive. Sailors chipped and painted rust, shined up her bright work, and holystoned the dark blue deck of the big blue fleet. The stained deck was, yes, dark blue. They also built a plywood and timber platform on the veranda deck next to number 2 turret, where selected press corps and photographers from around the world would be stationed. Mac, working with Halsey's staff and the Missouri's leadership, planned the ceremony to the exact minute. It would be short, but punctuality was key for MacArthur. Naval etiquette and procedure would reign above all, and as such, Halsey, and to a lesser extent, the CEO of Missouri, Captain Murray, had final say on what happened aboard the ship. Murray recalled that Shigemitsu would prove to be a problem in
And
terms of,
Shigemitsu, for our listeners, is going to be the head of the foreign ministry who's going to be signing this document. So,
yeah, thank you, John. Yeah. So he's going to be a problem in terms of minute by minute planning because he had lost a leg in an assassination attempt and walked on a wooden leg, which meant he could not move fast up and down ladders, across decks, into and out of boats. So to accomplish the to-the-minute plan that MacArthur wanted, Murray instructed sailors and his crew to try and replicate Shigemitsu's walk. As he said, we took young sailors and took a swab handle, that's a mop handle for you landlubbers, and they put the swab handle down the trouser leg of some of these young sailors so they couldn't bend the knee. They strapped it on them. They'd make them get in a small boat, just like the one the delegation would come over in, and that person would imitate Shigemitsu. Well, they practiced this about 20 times, figured out how long it took them to get into and out of the boat, from sitting in it, get up from the bottom platform onto the quarterdeck, across the gangway, then across the ship onto the starboard quarterdeck, or from the quarterdeck over to the starboard area where the ceremony would be held. And that's up to the veranda deck. So it's up another staircase. So these sailors got it pretty good. The average time was, in fact, the slowest time was in about 20 of these attempts was about a minute and a half, so 90 seconds. So the captain figured these sailors were more ambitious, they were younger than the Japanese gentlemen would be. So they doubled the time and said, okay, maybe 3 minutes was the time that they would allow for this part of the ceremony. He says, we can't allow much more than that or they'll get there too soon. So they thought they had it all set. What they're going to do is if he moves faster than anticipated, they would delay him. Slower than anticipated, they would speed him up. And this is the way they planned this silly but really worrisome bit of the ceremony, because nobody wanted to cross MacArthur in the ceremony, did they, Seth?
No, well, everything was down to a T. And if you watch the video of Shigemitsu coming aboard the ship, which I'll show, it is labored. Like it is a labored effort for him to move across the deck in any type of uh, quick fashion. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong. I know that we ended up sending a destroyer, our own destroyer, over to the docks to pick up the Japanese delegation. But then did we use a launch,
Yes.
or did the how close did the destroyer actually get to the Missouri? That's the question I've kind of wondered.
Not close at all, because they transfer these guys from the DD into like the captain's gig or something like
Gig,
that, and
and
then
then brought them over
Like
that way.
correct.
like an admiral's barge, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they come aboard via a wooden boat to the Missouri.
And
So
yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Good.
This leads to one of the myths around this surrender, which is Fuchida saying that he was present on board the Missouri during the surrender ceremony. And his story always was that, well, I had been put in charge of arranging transportation of the surrender delegation, the Japanese delegation, over to the Missouri, but then the Americans didn't need that. And so here I was sitting in this big, beautiful launch, and I just decided to go over to the Missouri myself right before the ceremony. I'm here to tell you that some anonymous Japanese guy showing up in a launch next to Third Fleet flagship, who is
Never
this?
happened.
Never happened. Who's in this launch? What's in that launch? Is that launch full of explosives? They would absolutely have blown that launch out of the water if he had tried coming up to this flagship. So that is nonsense. I'm sorry. I will never buy that story.
Well, there's no way it could have happened, because to that end, every single person that came aboard that battleship had an assigned place to be.
Yep.
They took a piece of tape or something and stuck it to the deck and wrote the dude's name on it. He's like, this is where you're going to stand,
You're going to stand.
You're not going anywhere else. This is where your ass is going to be.
Yep.
Everybody. It didn't matter if they were Chester Nimitz or Joe Smith. This is where you're going to be, and you're not going to move. And those were orders from Captain Murray, but those came from Halsey and obviously from MacArthur as well. So there's absolutely no way that Fuchida came aboard.
There's no improvising going on here. You're not going to be shown to a special location in the superstructure, as he claims, and
No,
Yeah, like any American is going to give up their vantage point of this ceremony for some anonymous Japanese dude who just happened to show up. Get out of
no,
here.
no,
Get real.
not even close. As a matter of fact, when some people, and we can talk about this in a second, when some people do actually try to move around, they
Yes,
are very roughly handled by
yes,
armed United
yes,
States
by armed
Marines.
Marines. Yeah, there was a famous incident when a Russian photographer tried to get off of that platform, move down onto the main deck, and up to a different spot to get a better location, and he was tackled by American Marines as he was climbing up a ladder. They ripped his pants off and then pulled him back down. So no, nobody's moving around in this ceremony. It was absolutely over organized, over controlled, because again, we are terrified that there could be a dirty trick up somebody's sleeve, that is going to lead to something bad happening on board our flagship.
Absolutely. So Halsey instructs Captain Murray, USS Missouri's captain, Captain Murray, Stuart Murray, by the way, is his name, to instruct the ship's navigator, who would be the officer of the deck, on September the 2nd to select side boys for the ceremony. And we alluded to this before, but this is where it happens. James Starnes was the guy's name. He was the ship's navigator on USS Missouri. He was told to select the tallest men he could find aboard the ship to be his side boys. Why? These men would stand four on each side as the Japanese were coming aboard USS Missouri. And Halsey and Murray wanted the tallest sailors that Starnes could find so they would tower over the Japanese as they came aboard the flagship. Just a show of
A little symbolism there.
brute force and symbolism. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
we're we're big boys, so don't do anything stupid. So Starnes assembled dozens of the crew and selected literally the eight tallest men he could find. I'll take you,
You
and you.
knew.
That's it. The effect, as he said later, was for the towering Americans to show dominance on the much shorter Japanese who would be coming aboard. Starnes recalled that the press were the first to arrive on that September 2nd day, as he said, and I quote, "There were a lot of them." Yeah, that's putting it mildly because they were everywhere.
Yeah.
Again, in the photographs and footage I'm showing now, guys are everywhere. They're like ants. They're everywhere, all over this thing. So the press, as I said, was the first to come aboard. They come aboard on the port side of the ship and they're led to their assigned spots and simply just stood there and waited. John, you put in here too, and you can see these guys. There are two or three Japanese on board recording this event
Yes.
as well.
Absolutely. And we were again concerned that, could there be a bomb in somebody's camera? What is going to happen here with these cameramen? And so each one of those Japanese personnel had an armed Marine guard with a 45 and making very sure that, that this gentleman understood, I'm standing right behind you. And if there's any funny business here, I will shoot you dead. So again, positive control over the ceremony. That's kind of what this was all about.
Indeed. Most of the press is aboard the ship by 07. Following them, the brass started coming aboard again from the ship's port side. Nimitz came aboard from Sodak, and when he did, and this is pretty cool, and Bill, you can talk about this, but Halsey's 4-star flag comes down, and Nimitz's 5-star flag goes up. Um, when Mac comes aboard a few minutes later, his 5-star flag goes up alongside of Chester Nimitz's, and that's a very uncommon thing aboard Navy vessels, isn't it?
There was a lot of controversy over this because there is no provision in naval regulation to fly an Army flag over a Navy ship, right?
Know that.
So yeah, so Mac,
Don't say over, say alongside, right?
yeah, yeah, just anywhere, right? And so
Yeah.
that's all been changed, but in these days, somebody had the unenviable duty of telling MacArthur that his flag was not going to be flown from the ship, and MacArthur talked to Halsey and opened and probably finger to the chest, and so I don't care about your stupid regulations. Here's what's going to happen, bull.
Right.
He would have called him that, even though Halsey hated it. And so, so they did, right? So Halsey tactfully checked with Nimitz, and Nimitz probably said words to the effect of, "I don't care, fly his flag." And so that
my guess is that it was probably an inch lower than Nimitz's flag.
I'm sure some signal. So it would have been the signal men who do this, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure they figured out a way to make this appropriate.
Right.
Yeah.
So when Mac does get aboard ship, he and his
And,
entourage, of which go,
and
go
there's
ahead,
some
John.
interesting footage of that too, actually.
There
Maybe
is.
you'll insert here
Mhm.
of them
Yeah.
Oh,
coming
that's right, because
aboard.
the admirals normally come aboard a ship with what's called an admiral barge, right? Captains have gigs, admirals have barges. But that wasn't good enough for MacArthur. He wanted a destroyer.
He came over on a
and,
destroyer. Yeah, tied up
and it's not a simple matter to pull a destroyer up next to a battleship.
to the port
Collisions
quarter
occur.
of the ship. Yeah.
Exactly. So because you got to get the gang. So this is he doesn't understand. He doesn't care about all that stuff. That he could have a collision and get really embarrassed if they aren't really
Right.
really careful. Well, they were really really careful, and it worked.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when he does get aboard with his entourage, and he's got a crew with him for sure, he goes right up to Bill Halsey, and he hadn't. And he, again, remember some of these episodes we talked about the relationship between Mac and Halsey. It was very good. It was
Yeah.
a very good relationship from the first time they met each other, and you wouldn't think so because they're both very gregarious personalities. Yet
Hmm.
they immediately became friends. Like the first time they met each other, they had a liking for one another, and they hadn't seen each other since 1943 face to face.
Hmm.
And so when Max sees Halsey, he immediately like, goes over and slaps him on the back, and kind of sort of does a bro hug, and
Right.
pumps his fist and calls him bull, which, like Bill was saying, Halsey absolutely hated that. But Mac was probably the only person alive that could get away.
Get away with it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So this is this is funny. So after greeting all the Navy brass, Halsey walks MacArthur through his quarters, through Halsey's quarters, where Mac would be, where he asked to be alone for a few minutes, I guess just to collect himself. So Halsey happily agrees, and the two part. The only other man in Halsey's quarters with Mac was Mac's pilot, a guy named Dusty Rhodes. Everybody whose last name was Rhodes, they had a nickname named Dusty for obvious
Yeah.
reasons.
Of course.
Right.
Mac was visibly nervous when he gets aboard. His hands are shaking. He's pacing like a tiger inside of Halsey's quarters. He all of a sudden vanishes into Halsey's private head and promptly begins puking his guts out over and over and over again. Rhodes politely raps on the door of the head and asks the general if he was okay, and Mac replied, "I will be in a moment." He is in there barfing his
Hurling.
lunch. Yeah. Minutes later, and I do mean minutes later, Max steps out of the head. He's visibly pale as a ghost, walks outside, and strikes a pose for the cameras below that had been sitting there the whole time waiting for him to do that very thing.
Yep.
Nothing if not the eternal showman. But
Yep.
yeah, Mac was nervous, and in the footage again, I'll show the footage. There's close-ups of him, like this side of him, when he's reading the speech that he wrote. His hands, I mean, he's shaking like a
Mm.
leaf. Like he is genuinely, genuinely nervous.
Hmm.
So most of the brass from the Pacific War was here. Spruance was on Okinawa
Not.
at, huh?
Oh, yeah. Was not.
Oh, yeah,
Spruance
yeah,
was
yeah.
not. Yeah.
Right. Spruance wasn't there. He was on Okinawa. Mitcher was in the States. Admiral Willis Lee had passed away by this time. But John, you want to talk about, and Bill, y'all wanted to talk about Spruance being deliberately kept away from this.
Yeah, Spruance was held back again in case there was Japanese treachery that ended up wiping out the majority of our senior officers right there in the bay. We had to have a competent naval leader who was capable of running the entire fleet in case we had to resume hostilities. And everybody understood that A, Spruance was capable of doing that, and B, he was a fairly cool, unemotional customer, and he was probably going to be the guy who would be least upset to be left off the deck of the Missouri for this particular ceremony. And so, yeah, he was nowhere to be found. He's back in Okinawa.
So Kelly Turner is there. John McCain is there. Charlie Lockwood is there. McCain and Mitcher's carrier admirals were there too. Radford, Arthur Bogan, John Towers, Forrest Sherman, Ted Sherman, Ziggy Sprague, Thomas Sprague, Roy Geiger, Kruger, Eichelberger, Kenny, Spotts, Stillwell, Richardson, Sutherland, Wainwright, and many, many, many others.
Yeah.
Clothed in their open shirt khakis. And this is, again, masterful
Love
stroke
that.
psychology. And this was
Mhm.
MacArthur's orders. I mean, the Navy
Yep.
did that anyway, but this was Mac was like, I want everybody to be as informal as humanly possible.
Right.
It presents this image of we just absolutely pulverized your empire into fine powder. And we did it with our open shirt khakis, and we couldn't be more relaxed if we tried. It's
Hmm.
it's
Mhm.
it's a masterful stroke of psychology. Honest to God, it is.
Despite the fact that he's been puking his guts out 5 minutes ago, but
Of
nevertheless,
course.
yeah,
Of course.
the symbology is there. Yep.
Tossing his cookies.
Mhm.
So, in front of this phalanx of leadership was a simple table covered in a green tablecloth, swiped from the ship's mess, and we'll get to that story, which is rather humorous in just a second, with 2 copies of the instrument of surrender on it. Bill, you wanted to talk about the green tablecloth. What is traditionally?
Yeah, yeah, so generally, the green tablecloth is used for captain's masts. In fact, our slang for somebody being having gone to captain's mast is, yeah, the dude had to stand in front of the green table. It's a green felt tablecloth, and it tickles me that that's the tablecloth that they used for the surrender ceremony, because this was a captain's mast of sorts, wasn't it, guys?
Right.
Kinda,
Very good.
yeah, yeah. You're
Yeah.
calling the perpetrators up to the table to
To the mast. Yeah.
yeah, to receive
Mhm.
Yeah.
their just rewards. So as Captain Murray from the Missouri recalls, we had placed our beautiful mahogany table and its 2 nice chairs, the present of Admiral Fraser and the British fleet on deck in the central spot, and it looked very nice there. One look at these, and he's talking about the surrender documents, and you might say all hell broke loose. These documents were about 40 inches by 20 inches each, and 2 of them had to be in line. Our beautiful mahogany table was 40 by 40. It just couldn't do it. They had
Yeah.
to get a different table. So,
And we had to get it now.
yeah, like right now, because this occurs literally minutes before the Japanese arrive here.
Yep.
That's
The launch is
that's when the
on the
documents
way.
showed up. Yeah, the
Yeah,
documents showed up. It's the first time they got to look at them. These things are huge. What do we do?
Huge.
We need 2
yeah,
of those tables. They're
Yep.
huge. And and so yeah, scramble, scramble, scramble.
Right.
big time. Big time. Murray recalled again. He says, quote, so I called the four nearest sailors and we headed for the wardroom, which was the deck below my cabin. Well, we got there and we're going to grab the wardroom table and get it up there. The wardroom table was bolted down. It should be, of course. So we dashed down to the next compartment to the crew's mess. The mess cooks just finished cleaning up the tables from the breakfast and were hanging their tables to the overhead to get them out of the way so they could watch the surrender ceremony from their place in the rear division. Well, we grabbed the first table, the crew's last table. The mess cooks were just cleaning it up, and that was it. Well, on the way to the wardroom, we knew we had to have a cover for that table, so I yanked a green table cover off the first wardroom table I came to and said to the guys out there on the deck to set up this mess table and spread the green cloth on it. It looked really nice. The group was all aboard then. I noticed Admiral Nimitz by the time we got the table squared away. That was a beautiful common touch to use the crew's general mess table and use a green cloth from the wardroom. Of course, there were little sarcastic remarks because it appears that the tablecloth I'd yanked off had a lot of coffee spots on it.
Scrambled eggs. God knows what else, right? Just,
And they wanted to know at the Naval Academy Museum why I didn't get a clean one. But that was the reason. No one was thinking about it then, least of all I. We had to have something and we had to have it in a hurry. I love
well,
that.
and,
That's
and the
awesome.
denouement to that story, too, is after the ceremony, they put the table back and they forget which one it is.
Indeed.
So, yeah, to this day,
Indeed.
the one that is in the museum, it's like, man, we
Maybe.
think it's the right one, but we don't actually know. So,
Exactly.
Yeah.
yeah,
So, John, the Japanese that are coming
yeah,
aboard, it's a lot
yeah.
of them.
There's a lot of them. Basically, the emperor has designated that there's got to be 3 or 4 representatives each from the foreign ministry, the army, and the navy to come aboard and do this thing. But the 2 real heavyweights here are going to be Foreign Minister Shigemitsu. And you may be wondering to yourself, well, wasn't there some guy named Togo who was the foreign minister? Last we were doing this, it was Togo in charge. the Suzuki government, as soon as the emperor made his decision and the surrender notice was read, the Suzuki government resigns. And so now we've got a new government in charge with a new foreign minister, and it is this gentleman, Shigemitsu, who's the lucky dude who is going to actually have to sign this document. The other heavyweight, of course, is our old buddy, General Umezu, who is directly ordered by the emperor. You are going to sign for the army, you lucky, lucky guy. And Umezu absolutely would have rather drunk hemlock at this point than be on the deck of the Missouri. But I think that there is a little bit of a twist of the knife going on here from Hirohito. He is basically telling, it's going to have to be some member of the Big Six from the army. And since Anami has already killed himself at this point, you, my dude, are going to be the lucky guy who gets to go and do this. And this is an order from your emperor, so go do it. And you can't kill yourself in the interim. Tough. So those are the guys that are going to be there. There's a number of other gentlemen as well. You've got Major General Nagai, Rear Admiral Tomoyoka, who he actually he's a rear admiral now. He was a captain back in 1942, and he played a fairly important role in the planning for the Battle of Midway. You've got a young gentleman, Kase Toshikazu, from the foreign minister, and you can pick these guys out relatively easily. The foreign minister guys all have top hats on, and Kase is the youngish one who is standing on sort of the right hand side of the classic picture of their delegation.
He's holding a briefcase.
Yeah, holding a briefcase. That's right. The other one that is really interesting to me is a guy named Sugita, Colonel Sugita. Sugita has been around the block. There's that famous photograph taken during the surrender of Singapore, where you have a group of officers, British officers, Percival in the front, carrying British flags, marching towards the Ford factory on Bukit Timah Hill in Singapore to meet up with General Yamashita and surrender at the end of that inglorious campaign. There's a Japanese officer in that photograph. That's Sugita. He was one of the staff and intel officers for Yamashita's 25th Army. Sugita also ends up on Guadalcanal at one point during that campaign. He's all over the Pacific. And so it's really sort of ironic that he was present at arguably Japan's greatest triumph at the beginning of the war was the demolishment of the British in Malaya. And now he's here on the veranda deck watching this surrender ceremony take place. The other sort of fun factoid I would trot out here is Kase Toshikazu, the young foreign affairs officer there. His son is going to go on to become an infamous right-wing revisionist who basically said that, we were pushed into war by the Americans and we were in the right and the Americans were in the wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, he was a great guy. But Kase is also the uncle of someone famous, Yoko Ono.
Get out.
This is a true fact. True
I'll
fact.
be damned.
Yep. So anyway, so
something.
There are a lot of interesting personalities on the Japanese side on this deck. Kase is going to go on to a very successful career in the foreign ministry after the war. And no, Mitsuo Fuchida was not here. And with that, let's roll.
So, Bill, tell us about the mood aboard ship.
Well, it's jovial and excited for the Americans, as you might expect. But the Japanese came aboard past Starn's 9-foot-tall side boys, and the mood grew somber, almost frigid. The Japanese, once aboard, stood in 3 rows at stiff attention. Shigemitsu and Umezu stood there looking down, assumedly in shame. Shigemitsu and Kase were both in formal tuxedo and top hat. Their mate Ota had dressed in white. The Japanese could not help but notice the 31-star American flag framed hanging on the battleship's side, not far from Mac, but I bet you they didn't know what that significance of that flag was. It was the same flag that Admiral Perry had flown when he first entered Tokyo Bay a century earlier. But that's the significance, of course, would have been lost on them based on the weight of the moment that was bearing down on them as they stood there. Mack kept the Japanese waiting for a full 4 minutes before the beginning of the ceremony. They just stood there. Initially, because of Shigemitsu's leg, the Japanese were about 1 minute late, but at 0900, the ship's gunnery officer shouted, "Attention all hands." I'm wondering if it was really attention on deck and he just recorded it wrong. Mack stepped on deck, followed by Nimitz and Halsey. Getting into position, Mack strode to the microphone and spoke.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
So Mack spoke with authority, and he did. But it was clear to all, as I said, that he was emotional. If you look at the footage, his hands are shaking like an absolute leaf. As the Japanese came forward to sign, there was an absolute silence aboard the ship. Shigemitsu, who could read and speak English fluently, appeared to act as if he did not know where to sign. Mack then told Sutherland, just off the cuff, show him where to sign. And Sutherland strides up there and literally points and like, here. Umezu was next. He avoided any eye contact whatsoever, did not take a seat, leaned over, signed quickly, and immediately retreated. Mack then took a seat and gestured for Wainwright and Percival to come forward. He retrieved 6 pens from his pocket and began to sign his name. He gave a pen to each of the former prisoners of war and saved the rest as gifts for later. Nimitz then signed and later said that he was so nervous that he shook with emotion as he signed his name for the United States. Other signatories signed their names, and one, Elmore Cosgrave of Canada, sorry, Mike Whitby, signed on the wrong line of the Japanese copy of the documents. 3 other signatories followed his example and also signed on the wrong line, a fact that Shigemitsu immediately noticed. Sutherland then solved the issue by striking out their printed names and wrote the correct names by their signed names. Years later, thinking on the moment, Mack wrote, and I quote, I wish that my pen were wielded by one on such intimate terms with words, those immortal heralds of thought which at the touch of genius become radiant, that at my call they would convey my feelings in terms that would satisfy the ultimate sources of reason, history, and interpretation. For I have a consciousness that in the events culminating in this immortal moment lie those truths which at last are transplanted into epics and lyrics, and those exalted terms in which we find on the lips of the great seers and prophets, unquote.
Yes,
Which
so
is
Seth,
not too bad.
Yeah, I was going to say he was pretty good.
Better
I
not
don't
would
know.
have been. So.
I think an English teacher would have handed him a copy of Strunk and White. All the English teachers in the audience will understand the reference, but why use 3, one small word when you can use 3 big ones? All
Hell
right.
yeah. Right.
But it was classic MacArthur. Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. It sounded good, though, for sure. So, of course, Mack concluded the ceremony with the immortal words, let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed. So, and this is, we talked about.
Japanese were blown away by how short this thing was, too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
they
was
couldn't
not, what is
believe
it, 20 minutes from beginning to end?
Yeah. Yeah. If. And yeah, we're done with this thing now. Get off my ship.
Get the hell off of my ship. Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they begin to leave, the Japanese do, and as they do, the noticeable absence of American fast carriers was erased as the low hum of aircraft grew into a steady roar. We talk about flexing.
Yeah.
Baby, this is a
This is a
flex.
flag.
This is a flex. Leading the pack were 600 B-29s from Kurt LeMay's City Busters. The 29s were followed by hundreds. I've seen varying estimates, roughly 450 American carrier aircraft flying in textbook tight formation at altitudes between 2 and 400 feet. The show of absolute pure force thundered over Tokyo Bay for 30 minutes. Mick Carney said, and I quote, "It was awe-inspiring. The parade would certainly have given pause to anybody that wanted to start anything again," unquote. I mean, just let it sink into you people who did this to you. And we could do it again anytime we want.
Right.
Yeah, these are the ones we have decided to show you this whole bunch where those came from.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Just an ultimate flex. So, Bill, tell us about Mac's recorded radio broadcast, which, by the way, there are audio copies of it, but sadly, they're really, really bad. I mean, it's not a good quality. Yeah, really is. It really is.
So here's a few excerpts, and I will quote. "Today, the guns are silent. A great tragedy is ended. A great victory has been won. The skies no longer rain death. The seas bear only commerce men everywhere who walk upright in the sunlight. The entire world is quietly at peace. The holy mission has been completed. And in reporting this to you, the people, I speak for the thousands of silent lips, forever stilled among the jungles and the beaches and in the deep waters of the Pacific, which marked the way. I speak for the unnamed brave millions homeward bound to take up the challenge of that future which they did so much to salvage from the brink of disaster. As I look back on the long, tortuous trail from those grim days of Bataan and Corregidor, when an entire world lived in fear, when democracy was on the defensive everywhere, when modern civilization trembled in the balance, I thank a merciful God that He has given us the faith, the courage, and the power from which to mold victory. We have known the bitterness of defeat and the exultation of triumph, and from both we have learned there can be no turning back. We must go forward to preserve in peace what we have won in war. A new era is upon us. Even the lesson of victory itself brings with it profound concern, both for our future security and the survival of civilization. The destructiveness of the war potential through progressive advances in scientific discovery has, in fact, now reached a point which revises the traditional concepts of war itself, unquote. Now, guys, I got to point out that he talks about the grim days of Bataan and Corregidor. He fails to mention Pearl Harbor. I know that's a minor issue, but that's where it really began.
Yeah.
Just, there you go. You can keep going there, Seth.
Yeah, it's a very symbolic speech for many, many reasons, but the way he closes it out, I think, is absolutely beautiful. And the man did have a way with words. Say what you want about MacArthur, but when he actually sits there and writes a speech, he does it very well. Yes, he does.
He does.
And he closes it out like this, and he says, "And so, my fellow countrymen, today I report to you that your sons and daughters have served you well and faithfully with the calm, deliberated, determined fighting spirit of the American soldier, passed upon a tradition of historical truth as against the fanaticism of an enemy supported only by mythological fiction. Their spiritual strength and power has brought us through to victory. They are homeward bound. Take care of them." Beautiful speech.
Yep.
Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I like the ending. Because that really does resonate, right? They're on their way home. Take care of them, those that survived.
Yep.
course, it takes a long time for a lot of them to get home, but
Yes.
but I mean, there's
That's true.
and that's something too. And I don't know if we'll necessarily get into that too deeply, but there's a lot of Marines and soldiers that get over there in 1940 in the Pacific in 44. They don't get home till like 46, 47. Some of them.
Mhm.
Yeah, my former Chinese religious thought teacher among them. He ends up with First Marine Division, landed in Shanghai, China, and is, in charge of beginning the process of repatriating Japanese troops, bringing them to Shanghai, putting them on ships, and sending them home. He's over there for a year or more.
Yeah, it doesn't just end like that and guys come
Yep.
home. It's a whole process.
Yeah, and to Mac's statement that the entire world is quietly at peace. That is
No,
absolutely not the case in places like Southeast Asia and certainly in China as well, obviously. So, yeah, beautiful poetic words, but not necessarily encompassing the true state of the entire planet at the cessation of this war.
indeed,
Mhm.
indeed. But it is over.
It
It
is over.
it is all over. And then, there's so much other things that happen. I mean, it's almost, I don't want to say it's immediate, but it's not far after that American goodwill starts pouring into the country of Japan. And by goodwill, I'm
Yep.
talking about food, medical supplies, other things that the Japanese had been severely lacking for a long, 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 long time.
Yep.
And like you were saying earlier, John, that endears us to them pretty quick,
Yeah.
pretty
No,
quick.
I think the fact that we have come out of that war with a staunch ally in the Japanese, who are a great ally to have, that does say a lot about both us and them as cultures. And good on us, I guess I would say, for having gotten to that point. And a lot of that does stem, again, I would argue, from the humanitarian and generally generous nature of the occupation that we end up foisting upon the Japanese at the end of this war.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Well, gentlemen,
yeah,
anything else you want to add as we
it's great.
close out the
No,
Pacific War?
my God.
And close out
Until
season 4. That's right.
until
Yeah.
we circle back and start again.
Of course, yeah, of course, which we're going to do. So
Yes.
as Bill was saying, this is the second to last episode of season 4. We're going to do a Q&A next week, and that'll actually be the last episode of season 4 as we start prepping for season 5. So we got a lot of stuff we want to talk about there, all kinds of even before 1941, a lot of 1940 and even stuff even earlier than that, 37, all kinds of China stuff and
Yes.
CBI stuff and Singapore and Philippines and we're definitely going to talk about the actual fall of the Philippines and not just breeze over it
Yeah.
because there's a
Yeah.
Mhm.
lot of stuff that goes down there.
So much to talk about there. So,
Mhm.
anyway,
All
cool.
right, fellas,
Thank you.
let's wrap
Yeah.
this sucker. All right, so
Yes,
with
sir.
Let's do
that,
that.
we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Please give us a rating and review wherever you receive your podcast. We do appreciate it. If you got a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, my good friend, thank you as always for being here with us. This
Always
one
a pleasure.
was this one
Yeah.
was a this one was a pleasure. This one was a good one to end up with, I think.
Thank you for having me, as always.
Absolutely. Bill, bring us home.
And I'll see you again next week with my non-alcoholic beverage.